Now, after having to move a second time within the same single summer, let's catch up a bit, shall we? So Concord came and went. Yes, I want to talk about Concord because, oh my god, what a train wreck. That wasn't surprising at all considering how all possible ambitions were deflated when we first saw the game back in May 2024. Really, it's not that big of a surprise, but the way it crashed and burned the way it did, even I didn't see coming. I thought this game was going to get maybe a few thousand players and then just sort of fade into obscurity over the months. I didn't expect it to get pulled from sale less than 2 weeks after launch. That's insane. Absolutely insane. Anyways, yes, as you've probably already heard by so many other podcasts, media outlets, and YouTube channels, Concord is dead. Developer Firewalk Studios insists that it isn't and that they're simply going back to the drawing board, but let's be honest. Who are we kidding? It's dead. It is absolutely dead. The player count wasn't high, none of the characters were actually drawing in attention, and any conversation surrounding it was plagued by mouth breathers calling the game, "Oh, it's woke," because of pronouns. By the way, do we not understand that pronouns are just a basic part of human language? Or at least the English language? Are we really going to start throwing tantrums over adverbs next? I mean, at this rate, conjunctions might be the cause of another insurrection and we'll be hunting down the conductor from Schoolhouse Rock. Like, come on, guys. Why are we still on this? Anyways, in all honesty, though, there was a part of me that was somewhat curious about Concord after we saw that nothing burger of a teaser back in 2023. To me, that teaser told me that Concord was going to be like No Man's Sky and focus on space exploration with friends, but with the 70s sci-fi aesthetic. I would have totally been on board, and I sort of was, but, you give me a teaser, I don't exactly feel anything, so I need to see gameplay first before I decide if I'm even going to be on board. And then we finally saw the game for the first time ever in May 2024, and it was just... what even was this? Who was this for? Online PvP hero shooter? I'm sorry, but we already have a George, and he's got a powerful booty. And if I'm playing a game that has such an intense focus on team deathmatch, then I'm just gonna grab some friends, and we're gonna play Doom. Why would I play Concord? Both Doom and Overwatch feel good to play in how characters and mechanics control, and they both have a visual identity, which neither of those Concord has. Concord is severely lacking in both of those fields. And that's the main suspect in what killed Concord, in my eyes at least. The character design, specifically in this game, is all over the place and it makes absolutely no damn sense. You got Trash Robot, Alien Cat Lady, Emo Goth from Hogwarts, a Floridian Lifeguard. None of these characters look like they would ever be caught standing next to each other under any circumstance. When a crossover game like Smash Brothers or a standard hero shooter like Overwatch puts characters next to each other that would never be seen together, there is still an aesthetic being followed, even if it's subtle, like in texture work, or lighting, or color schemes, etc. Let's take Smash, for example. Mario doesn't look the same in Smash as he does in his own games, but that's because he and the rest of the cast are still following rules in more subtle areas like tone, texture, lighting, color scheme, saturation, the whole 9 yards. That's why Smash has never looked weird, despite featuring characters from drastically different IPs with drastically different art styles. They all still fit some rule set in visuals. Overwatch is a bit more focused in how they want their characters to look, but even when you have a cyborg gorilla, a hamster in a tank, and an angsty smurfette, there is still a theme being used as new characters from pre-existing factions get added to the game. White and orange is for Overwatch. Dark colors like purple and black are for Blackwatch. Leather and cowboy attire or biker attire can be associated with the Deadlock Rebels or the Junkers. You get some idea on what the character is like, who they might be allied with, what they're about, and maybe even get an idea on how they might play. Concord, on the other hand, There's just no consistency in its own roster of original characters. You got one character looking like C-3PO's ex-wife, and another character looking like NASA's embracing a new obsession for slacks. And then, you have a mushroom man who has a gun that shoots bees, but the lady in the beekeeper outfit gets a regular grenade launcher? Like, what the f*** is happening? In the couple of hours I gave Concord, I just kept hearing a video from Masahiro Sakurai in the back of my head. Over on his YouTube channel, Masahiro Sakurai on Creating Games, Sakurai uploaded a video about how to establish your characters effectively. A crucial point he touched upon was that your character needs to have an identifiable silhouette. There are a handful of ways to do this, like gesture and exaggeration, as Sakurai points out in the video. I was even taught this back when I was studying animation in late high school and early college. Exaggeration is just animation and character design 101, and even if you're going for a realistic amount of detail like Concord, you still need some level of exaggeration somewhere for your characters to stand out. But in the months leading up to launch, Firewalk and Sony pulled the same nonsense about letting us get a feel for the characters and get to know them and know their stories. Dudes, you didn't need weekly cutscenes to convey this crap, okay? Freaking Drawn to Death utilized a better method in getting to know characters. In Drawn to Death, everyone had certain lines uttered when defeating specific characters. Bronco and Johnny Savage are the two that stick out to me. And those two had a couple of lines that pretty much told you everything you needed to know about their relationship. They were friends until something happened that caused a rift between them, and now they're enemies. End of story. I didn't need weeks of cutscenes just to experience the story, so we could get to know the characters and the story, and our story is so good. We put so much time into the writing and creating the world and the story. Oh my goodness. Oh, the story. Oh, the story's so good. Character's so good. Narrative. This is a video game, damn it. I'm sorry if I'm sounding harsh here, but from where I'm standing, the character design single-handedly caused this game to fail. It wasn't because, oh, it's woke, it's the character design. The idea that it was because of pronouns is just really freaking weird and shows how obsessed some folks have become with matters that are beyond trivial. Generally speaking, the whole attitude of the gaming community has been weird towards this game from the very second it was announced. On one end, you have people suddenly caring about Firewalk's fate and whether Sony might shut the studio down. Yes, that sucks. It absolutely does. There are people's jobs on the line, and I get that. But nobody here has any business playing the sympathy card. 600 of us gave Concord the time of day. And the rest of us didn't buy it. That was our way of saying, we do not want your game, so we are not buying it, we are not supporting it. And now all of a sudden we feel sorry? On the other end, you have people celebrating the failure and saying weird shit like, oh, the gamers have won. We showed them. All because of personal, uneducated, dumbass politics. Guys, there is more to this story than just frickin' dumbass personal beliefs and, oh, the game failed. No, there's more here. This is a studio that took 8 years to develop an online PvP shooter with a team of more than 100 people and a budget that cost Sony hundreds of millions of dollars between the development for it and the acquisition of Firewalk. Politics had nothing to do with this colossal failure of a game. We should be discussing the bigger problem that Sony and the rest of the AAA space continues to inflict upon itself. And it's been happening for way too long. For a long time now, I've seen a wealth of articles about developers and publishers talking about how game development is so expensive, costs so much money, you have no idea. And I can understand that. I really can. And I absolutely don't have any idea on how I would run a game studio and how much money I would need to keep costs low and make sure everybody can live. As I stated in my false nostalgia video, though, Costs are not just tied to developers. Game companies need to pay bills to keep the lights on, and they are bills that you wouldn't really expect on the surface. Literally. There are costs tied to running a company that normal folks like us who don't run companies, especially video game companies, we don't even think about these problems. Who needs to be paid for water, gas, and electric utilities? What is a good accounting firm that can reliably handle and distribute paychecks to our staff? How much can we spend to maybe treat the staff to a company event without causing it to inflate our budget or run us into the red, but allow us to keep employee morale up? How much money should we reserve if a piece of tech breaks or if the building our staff are working in needs repairs? What insurance benefits can we offer to hopefully attract a valuable employee? This employee is doing really, really well and we want them to stay, but how much of a raise can we afford to give them? How much would it cost us to do this one thing ourselves versus outsourcing and paying another company to do it? There are so many situations outside of making a video game that can ramp up costs. Whether you want to attribute that to a product's budget is up to you. Either way, it's money being spent, and it's money not being put towards making the game. At least not directly. I'm not saying Sony or the other publishers are not thinking about these things. I'm sure the people running these companies are a lot better at decision making than I am, but whenever I see a game like Concord and another developer or publisher makes the game development is so expensive excuse, that's when the questions start cropping up. Where did your budget go? Why did it take so long to make this kind of game? Did you even playtest this, and did you do it properly? It's the same questions many people ask when these kinds of disasters happen in the video game space. And in the case of Concord, again, we have seen the same exact answers. The budget went towards the visuals, development took that long because no one had the audacity to say no to Firewalk, and of course, it was playtested, but most likely not playtested by the players we would have hoped to have. At least ideally. But let's unpack this whole thing one little bit at a time. The problem with budgets hasn't been anything new. The overspending has been a problem in the gaming industry since the early years of video games, but for wildly different reasons. We can go back to when Atari spent so much money on any game they could make that it caused the entire market to crash in 1983. However, the overspending then is not the same as the overspending we have seen over the last 20 years. When the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 launched in 2005 and 2006, I noticed a weird trend in how other people were talking about video games. Suddenly, the other kids were talking about this game looking good, and that kind of talk just always confused me when the trailers they kept pointing at were cinematic teasers. Where was the video game? Was it buried underneath the realistic visuals? This further escalated as more and more games pushed for graphics with even finer details and textures, smoother rendering of character models, more particle effects, more dynamic cameras, more of what I found to be pure spectacle that, more often than not, amounted to nothing. And it got really excessive the more that games kept getting praised for graphics and looking good and looking amazing and oh my god, the graphics! Goodness, it was like I was living the frickin' 80s. And I can list you several examples of this sort of thing. You had Sonic 06, you had the post-Modern Warfare Call of Duty games, and I mean the original Modern Warfare games. Almost every single Battlefield saw this kind of talk. All of the Halo games that came after 3 and Reach, Rogue Warrior, The Order 1886, Anthem, Aliens Colonial Marines, and of course, just about every single frickin' sports game under the sun. Oh, this game looks good! Does it? Does it really? Clearly, companies were more worried about making games look good rather than play good, and you saw that when these kinds of games were coming out, looking good, and then people are like, what the hell is this? This plays like shit. And it was a lesson that everyone would remember for only about 5 seconds and then immediately forgot about. Imagine burning through so much money just for a game to look good. Am I right, Sony? Speaking of Sony, playtesting has been an issue that almost seems very specific to Sony, and we've seen it firsthand in a couple of their first-party titles now. You don't have to go back too far to see this unless you weren't playing video games in 2022. When Horizon Forbidden West launched that February, all anybody could talk about was how Aloy wouldn't shut the hell up for 2 seconds. Whenever a new hurdle presented itself, Aloy would breathe out the solution before the player could even process what was happening in the moment. We've all been there, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. You come across a wall for you to climb, and she just goes, okay, now I just gotta climb over this wall, and hopefully Eridor, whatever the hell his name is over the cliff. And then I can jump and strike the core of that thunder jaw. Like, that's what I was talking about. Like, you just got there and you're already telling me the solution. God of War Ragnarok had an equally horrendous habit of doing this, and practically spelled out the solution the second players got into certain areas. We didn't even get the time to look at all the puzzle pieces and try to figure out what was needed. And it was one of the many problems with that game that actually caused me to quit 7 hours in. And the reason Aloy and Kratos and company became chatterboxes is because of how excessive Sony is with playtesting. You can tell. Before we continue, I do want to say that I understand playtesting is absolutely crucial when developing a video game. You want to make sure that your designs are communicating to the player, letting them know what they need to do, where they need to go, all while not being overly explicit about it. You almost never want to be explicit about it. It's why I love Luigi's Mansion so much. When you earned a key, you were rewarded with a new breadcrumb to follow and told what room that key leads to. It was a new room to go to, and hopefully you'll find another clue as to where Mario has been taken. Info was the reward, but when you entered the room for the first time, the game gave you a little bit of time to observe your new surroundings before ghosts started showing up. Sometimes, ghosts wouldn't show up until you fiddled around with some objects. It was a perfect balance between navigating the player through the game and giving them enough freedom to figure out what to do next. It never held your hand. And that's the problem with Horizon and God of War. It's that they were constantly holding your hand, and that's where the excessive playtesting was clearly a problem with those two games. Yes, as a developer, you want to make sure the player can tell what they need to do and how things work and where they need to go, the whole 9 yards. However, the willingness to just explicitly tell the player what they need to do begs the question, who playtested the game? Was it players experienced in those genres? Was it a group of people who don't regularly play video games? Was it a group of players that only play one specific video game? Were they players who were familiar with these franchises? These aren't questions to insult the playtesters themselves, I promise you. These are questions that are crucial in meeting your audience's expectations and knowing the people who are going to be attracted to your game. And frankly, we all know that one person who is excellent in one genre but is awful in another. Everyone's got a strength in one field and a weakness in another. For example, I once had a roommate who did just fine in Mario Kart, but he could not understand Tetris to save his life. The most basic of puzzle video games. Tetris. My buddy Alex, hey Al, you're probably watching this, he's ruthless in Civilization 6 and Dark Souls 3, but he can never seem to beat me in a game of Mario Party. And as for me, I can absolutely compete in Crash Team Racing tournaments, and I have clocked in over 1,000 hours into Dead by Daylight. But does that make me the perfect candidate to play test an online FPS game like Concord? I don't think so. We all have our strengths and weaknesses in various genres of games, and if I was making a game like Concord on this scale and was playtesting as excessively as Sony clearly does, then gaming history would be important to me. I would value the feedback and want people to playtest my game if they have played games or extensively played games like Counter-Strike, Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege, and even Doom. Because those are the games you're competing against. You need to know what your competition is doing. And just the way Concord plays, who did they have playtesting this? This is exactly where I have to wonder how excessive playtesting was for Concord, how closely Firewalk might have followed that feedback, or if the right questions were even being asked at all during development. Maybe it's just me, but again, I fail to believe that anybody who playtested this game said that moving around felt great or shooting felt good. You cannot settle for something as slow and stiff and clunky as Concord when the games that you are competing in, again, Counter-Strike, Overwatch, Rainbow Six, and Doom, they have significantly better game feel, just objectively. And that makes me ask, were there people in your playtest who were complaining that the game was moving too fast? And marketing's intense focus on characters and story begs me to ask if there were more questions about visuals and characters than there were about the controls and the gameplay. I'm sure there were some, but how much feedback was truly considered, and did you implement the right areas of feedback that should have been considered? I'm not saying that as in you didn't, I'm asking that as a genuine question. And for the record, people online can be awful with the phrase get good, yet there is a point to be made when you have possibly inexperienced players testing your game and they just don't play first-person shooters, they don't play online team-based games, they don't play games like the game you're trying to make. And just to clarify, this is all speculation. Again, I'm not saying that Sony didn't do this or Firewalk didn't do this, but from the looks and how Concord plays, it certainly doesn't come off like anything was done. And the state that Concord launched in does have me curious as to how playtesting was conducted, especially, again, knowing Sony's track record with recent titles, like I mentioned earlier, with Horizon and God of War. And that's sort of what leads into the last point that I was making earlier, the fact that nobody told Firewalk no. Now, I'm all about letting the devs cook and come up with something that might hit. But here's the thing about Concord, right? This game started development back when Overwatch and Guardians of the Galaxy were at the peak of their respective popularity. That was 6, 7, 8 years ago. Doesn't matter which number you want to go with, that is still a long as hell time to be spending on a game with characters this mundane. Before Sony acquired the studio in 2023, Firewalk belonged to another company called Probably Monsters. So, Sony may not have had much to say in Concord's development like some are probably believing. Even so, how did Concord not get canceled? Even in 2020, during the pandemic, the live service and online multiplayer markets were crowded. Granted, this was at the start of the pandemic when everyone had to stay inside, but people were checking out all sorts of games. All the usual suspects, Fortnite, Destiny 2, Warframe, Call of Duty, Dead by Daylight, they all exploded in 2020 and 2021. You can see the Steam charts for these. Well, maybe not Fortnite, but you get what I'm saying. And they grew in a way where they have each solidified and claimed their own slice of the online gaming market. It's why we saw so many games mid and post-pandemic die off so quickly. There was a boom in this period that was just so big that if your game was not out already within those last couple years of pre-pandemic, it was never taking off. Not unless you're willing to hold off another handful of years and or wait for one of those aforementioned games to start bleeding in player counts. And by 2020, who knows how much Concord was costing Firewalk and Probably Monsters? You are now 3 or 4 years into the hole, the game still isn't out, and your competitors are thriving off of an inflated market. So now you have one of two choices to decide between. And that is going to determine whether or not these last few years have been a monumental waste of your time. You either A, cancel the game and try to recycle assets and make something else if the funding is still available, or B, power on through, stick to the plan, and hopefully we can cast a net wide enough later on to pull in an audience and pray that the player base is sizable enough for us to continue working on the game after launch. But with those character designs, whenever they were made, I would have been like, hell no. We either need to go back to the drawing board with these characters, or we need to pull the plug on this project before it costs us more money. And as we have seen just now, Firewalk and Probably Monsters, they went with the latter. They spent 4 more years on this game while their competitors continued to thrive and have only found more success with bigger expansions, licensed DLC, so on and so forth. And what do they have to show for it? Oh, it's a first-person hero shooter where you can play team deathmatch and capture the flag and kill confirm. You know, because I can't do that already in Call of Duty or Fortnite or Rainbow Six. I can't do any of those things. And look at all of these original characters that we've included with such unique stories, like Tio. Tio? Just, again, did nobody internally think, this isn't it? What about this game was so unique and so promising that Sony saw Firewalk and said, oh shit, we really need these guys? Did anybody actually look at this and say, this should probably be reworked, let's take another crack at this thing? You didn't have to scrap the game entirely, but there's clearly no focus here. You need some kind of a theme between the characters that makes sense. Tighten the focus, make the characters more coherent in colors and tone and look like they do fit in with each other, and not like I'm looking at a Nerf action figure standing next to some dude in a life vest. Was there a moment at all where you might have had a gray-boxed version of Concord and messed around with physics or controls? Because again, the intense focus on characters and story tells me that the budget, the playtesting, everything was all focused on other areas that did not need to be focused on. It was nothing but pure spectacle that has now ultimately amounted to nothing. Just like all of those games that my classmates used to say looked good. Oh, it looks so good, you guys! And I think what upsets me most about Concord is not the fact that this was a situation that could have been easily avoided had the game been canceled or, at the very least, refined with some understanding of how art works. It's the fact that no one is going to learn anything from this. Not the folks who only buy AAA games and nothing else. Not the terminally online who can't remove their politics from something as basic as a bowl of SpaghettiOs. Not the scalpers who think Concord is suddenly worth more money than a copy of Splatterhouse. And not even a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the funds for high-level data analysis like Sony. In the 20 years since video games became more and more mainstream, I'd like to think many of us have come to understand what makes a game quote-unquote good. I've even come around to realizing that a game can look good in ways that don't automatically default to graphics. And yet, in 2024, clearly the same mistakes are still being made, the same ones we saw in 2019, 2015, 2014, all the way back to 2005. It's still graphics and story first, and gameplay sixth. Obviously, there are AAA studios that don't follow that mindset. I think of Capcom and Bandai Namco and mostly Japanese developers. But after so many flops where games have clearly overspent, overhired, overanalyzed, overcorrected, over everything, why are the same mistakes, the same exact ones, still happening? And before anybody in the comments goes and starts saying, oh, video games are dying, stop what you're doing. I got a video for you folks soon. I don't think the problem is that creatives aren't running PlayStation or most of the AAA studios. I don't even think it's because of how bloated the market has become in recent years either. You know, the competition is strong, but it's kind of always been strong. Honestly, I don't even know what the problem is anymore. Everything about Concord seemed like such an obvious sign to not move forward with the project that I just simply do not know what the problem is anymore. In my eyes, Concord is the embodiment of how insufferable the gaming space has become. People saying yes to almost anything because of shared sentiments, or fear of being the odd man out, or wanting to feel vindicated by every little thing. No one is listening to actual criticism, let alone understanding how to properly criticize something outside of, it's so bad, cringe. There's floods of meaningless talking points from every direction that have nothing to do with the topic at hand. And by the time we all wake up hungover and trapped in the pit that we've dug ourselves into, we'll have no recollection of how we got here, we'll accept our situation, and then move on like nobody's business. And like the whole thing never happened. So pay no attention to the bodies behind us because, oh my god, guys, did you see the new trailer for Fair Games? It looks so good. It looks so good, you guys.